Up until now, I've mostly created Si-Hyuk related content in English, mainly to help international audiences who might miss the nuances of what's happening in Korea. But as I watched the Korean coverage of this investigation, headline after headline, recycling the same shallow framing, I realized that the real language barrier isn't just English versus Korean. Even Korean speakers are being blocked from understanding what's actually going on because so much of the reporting is repetitive, sensationalized, and lacking content. So I first made this video in Korean, trying to explain the case clearly to viewers inside Korea who were left confused or overwhelmed. Now, once it was done, I figured that why not make an English version also? Because everyone deserves to understand the story properly. And also structure this video as simply as possible. First, a Q&A session that walks through the facts, and then like a comment-style rebuttal section addressing the most common accusations one by one. So yes, this video started in English, but I felt like making it in English version also matters because misunderstanding isn't only about language. Sometimes it's about how poorly the story is told. Okay, so let's start here. As you probably know, recently, Si-Hyuk, chairman of HYBE, aka Hitman Bang, returned to Korea from the US. And headlines erupted saying police were now launching a full investigation into him for so-called fraudulent market manipulation. Now, in short, he's accused of telling investors back in 2019 that HYBE had no plans to go public, only for a private equity fund connected to him to buy up their shares, and then sharing hundreds of billions of won in profit after the IPO. Now, critics say that this wasn't properly disclosed to financial authorities or during the listing review. And before flying back, Si-Hyuk emailed HYBE employees worldwide to apologize and said he would cooperate fully with the investigation, just as he did previously when questioned by the financial regulator. The real problem is that none of this makes sense from headlines alone. That's why I went back, read the original filings and financial journalism, pieced together the timeline, and tried to translate everything into a human-sized explanation. Now, to be clear, I'm not doing this because I want to defend Si-Hyuk, because, he's a billionaire. He does not need my help. And honestly, I barely have time as it is. I'm too busy studying other artists. And in fact, I am actually currently working on another cipher to talk about this whole issue while doing my own music and rap. And within the verse, I think there are like couplets that says something like, honestly, I barely have time. I'm too busy standing BTS. So why on earth would I go out of my way to defend Bang PD? He's a billionaire. He will be fine, or something like that. But what does bother me is watching the media and comment section trolls weaponize like half-baked headlines to sway public opinion, using HYBE and Si-Hyuk as an example to punish or something. And I hate thinking about what that does to HYBE's artists and their fans and employees and the families behind the employees. Because imagine watching your favorite artist company or your workplace dragged through the mud in the news every day. It wears you down. And imagine you are like parents of, your children who work at the company and seeing all these headlines attacking the company. It wouldn't feel good. So even though I'll much rather be making fun artist-related content, this kept nagging at me, and that's why I've made this video. Again, this isn't a story that you can understand just by skimming a few articles. So I went back to the source, dug through paid reports from the Bell and the Deal sites, like the professional media agencies, with expertise in capital markets industry, and try to lay it all out as simply as possible. Okay, and I think if you go to this Korean video, I mean, I also laid out these templates for people who will rage without watching the video, and these are the sorts of comments that you will see in Korean whenever they see videos talk about Bang Si-Hyuk, criticizing the messenger, not the message. All right. Anyways, let's start here. The first question that everyone asks is, why has Bang Si-Hyuk been indicted? So according to the Securities and Futures Commission, aka the SFC, between 2018 and 2019, Bang Si-Hyuk allegedly suggested that HYBE's IPO would be delayed. Certain investors then sold their shares, which were purchased by a private equity fund linked to him. And when HYBE eventually did go public, those shares shot up in value, earning Bang Si-Hyuk's side roughly 400 billion Korean won in profit. And that brings us to the keyword that the SFC keeps using, that is deception. And what does the SFC mean by that? In Korean, is 기망, deception. The deception here means causing someone to make a wrong decision by leading them to believe something untrue. The authorities argue that Bang Si-Hyuk made investors think the IPO would be delayed so that they would sell. But those familiar with the capital markets point out that even regulators seem cautious in their language. Because unlike past cases, the SFC didn't say Bang Si-Hyuk lied outright, only that he made it seem as though the IPO would be delayed. And even when you're the final decision maker, like Bang, IPO timing is hard to predict, and it can change based on business conditions. And that's why experts say that it's difficult for the SFC to prove intentional deception here. Now, what is the investment industry skeptical about? Because many people believe that those original investors, didn't sell because they were fooled, but because they needed to. For example, LB Investment had a fund expiring and their own IPO coming up. So taking profit on HYBE through the secondary market made sense. They even approached HYBE first about selling and later bragged publicly that they made over 100 Korean billion won from the investment. The Legend Capital also faced fund expiry and LP pressure. Alphen Route, on the other hand, was caught in the something called line fund redemption crisis. So in other words, they chose to sell and none of them complained after HYBE listed. Now, the next logical question is this: what are earnouts? So here's a quote from one of the paid articles, like subscribers only articles within the Bell and the Deal site platforms, telling you about what really went on back in the day in the capital markets industry. So you know the backstory like this. In LB Investment's case, their fund was about to mature and they were preparing for their own listing, so it was natural for them to exit. They wanted to lock in returns and sold HYBE shares on the secondary market to stick investment at a high profit. LB Investment had initiated conversations about exiting as early as 2018. HYBE looked for a new buyer to support its early investors' liquidity needs, and Stick came in that role. In October 2018, Stick bought 12.4% for 103.9 billion Korean won. LB publicly promoted the success of the deal. Their CEO even told the press they made 100 Korean won from the big hit investment. Now, even though I said that this is a paid article, they released it for free after a few days. So they first, open their premium articles for subscribers, then release them for free after a few days. Okay, so you can go read them if you want. I think I have already translated a few of them into English and uploaded them on my Patreon page. Anyways, now the next logical question is, what are earnout and putback options? Earnout is a contract where executives receive a share of gains only if the investment succeeds. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about Bang Si-Hyuk HYBE IPO case. And putback option, on the other hand, is a clause that forces executives like Pang to reimburse investors if the IPO fails. And the SFC calls Pang Si-Hyuk's earnout profit-taking deal unfair. But the industry says that this kind of risk and reward structure is totally standard in private equity deals. And what about this? Didn't retail investors lose big after HYBE's IPO? So it's kind of true because HYBE stock dropped on its first day. But that up and down pattern was very common in the IPO market at the time. And HYBE's low free float, meant that the fall wasn't particularly unusual. And if you look at other huge IPO cases that happened at the time, that up and down movements and then shooting up and then plummeting pattern was quite common. Okay, and many of them have not even still recovered their stock prices, like Kakao Bank and Kakao Pay. Okay, next up. Wasn't even the National Pension Service in Korea a victim? And actually, no, this is not the case because NPS, National Pension Service, they invested in both the early LB fund and the STIX pre-IPO fund and actually made billions in profit on HYBE's listing. And they likely made more in post-listing trades as well. Okay? Now, how about this? Why is Eastern PE such a big deal? Or why are they controversial? Because it was set up by Pang Si-Hyuk's longtime colleague named Kim Jung-dong. And that fund signed earnout and put back contracts with Pang Si-Hyuk. And some people claim that past investors weren't aware of how close that relationship was. But Pang Si-Hyuk's side argues that Kim Jung-dong wasn't even on HYBE's payroll at the time, and that investment managers joining boards post-transactions is common market practice. And that leads to another question. What's the difference between Eastern PE Fund number 1 and Fund number 2? Fund number 1 was created in June 2019 to buy out an insider's stake. To be specific, it was actually the vice president, Choi Yu-jung, her entire stakes. So conditions were very investor-friendly. No earnout, only downside protection. Now, Fund 2, which was created in November 2019, it was launched after BTS exploded internationally. So competition was strong and standard terms, including earnout, were used. And the industry sees that as a natural difference based on timing and purpose. Now back to Kim Jung-dong. Why is former CEO Kim Jung-dong even being argued about? The SFC suspects that Pang Si-Hyuk and Kim Jung-dong colluded. But Kim was not in any high position when the funds were set up, nor was he running them. And critics say that it's too much to call it conspiracy, just because they are acquainted. Now, what happens from here? This now heads into the court system. Many expect 2 years or more of litigation, possibly up to the Supreme Court. Until then, we won't know if the court sees this as intentional deception or simply a technically aggressive but legal transaction. Okay, so we will have to wait and see. Now, that wraps up the Q&A for people seeing this topic for the first time, or still having a hard time grasping the gist of it, okay? But the problem is, the online comment sections, especially in Korea, tell a very different story. Like, with nothing but headlines in hand, people act like they already know all the facts and go straight into throwing accusations. Facts get twisted and context is lost. But mind you, I'm not sure whether these people who write comments are just the general public or those who have certain agenda in their mind. Who knows? That's hard to prove. So now, I want to walk through the most common types of hate comments or accusations and, try to lay out facts, some of which could debunk these comments one by one, okay? Not just to say you are wrong, but to show why they are not correct and where the misunderstanding comes from, okay? So the most common accusation I see goes like this. Pang Si-Hyuk tricked all the investors and ran off with the money. But the truth is that the major early investors like LB Investment and Off and Route sold their HYBE stakes at profits ranging from hundreds to thousands of %. And some exited because their funds were expiring or they needed liquidity. And despite what regulators are suggesting, there's very little evidence that these investors actually lost money. Most cashed out willingly. Then you will hear something like he lied to investors and bought the shares cheap, even though the IPO was basically happening already. But again, at that time, each of those investors had very clear independent reasons for selling. One fund was about to expire, another was under pressure from institutional LPs, and another was facing a redemption crisis due to something called Lime scandal. And they chose to sell. The fact that none of them sued after the IPO is a big sign that the word deception doesn't really fit, because none of them complained or took legal actions after HYBE went public, IPO. Another popular take is this. Pang Si-Hyuk said HYBE wasn't going to IPO. That's straight up fraud. Except those comments were made in late 2019 when HYBE, the comment that Pang Si-Hyuk allegedly made. It was made in late 2019 when HYBE was still negotiating with SoftBank's Vision Fund. Okay, their top priority wasn't IPO. It was rather receiving direct investment from SoftBank's Vision Fund. And the actual IPO process didn't formally start until January 2020 when the underwriter was selected. So not announcing an unconfirmed IPO is actually standard in the industry. So it's hard to call that a deliberate lie. What about this? Even if they didn't lose money, meaning original investors, those investors still lost out on what they could have made. So, in other words, this refers to like the lost opportunity. And that sounds emotionally valid, but legally speaking, that's not a loss. The law only counts realized and actual financial damage. Like saying they could have made more if they had waited. It's called opportunity cost. And you cannot use that to charge someone with fraud. Now let's move into the earnout arguments. Like saying something like sharing billions through an earnout is obviously unfair. And actually, earnouts are totally standard in private equity. Executives only get paid if the investment succeeds, and they take downside risk through a putback clause. And in this case, it was investors who insisted on that structure, not Pang Si-Hyuk, it turns out. If both risk and reward are shared, calling it a scam is kind of oversimplifying. How about this? Pang Si-Hyuk hid the earnout contract, and that's illegal. Not necessarily, because whether it even had to be disclosed is a legal gray area. Back in 2020, revenue sharing deals between specific shareholders often weren't considered material, so it's a financial term, material items in IPO filings. And HYBE and law firms and the underwriter review it and made a judgment call. And yeah, they approached and worked with multiple major law firms and major underwriters and made a judgment call. And ultimately, it's for the court to decide if it was material or not. How about this? Number one, we kind of briefly talked about this, all right? Fund number one had no earnout, but fund number two did. So obviously, they cooked something up in between. And actually, like I said, the two funds were totally different. Fund number one was more like an emergency liquidity vehicle to clean up an insider's stake. To be specific, Choi Yoo-jung, vice president and co-founders of Big Hit. She was in a personal situation, where she had to sell all her stake. I don't know. Who knows the exact reason? I wasn't able to figure that out. And it doesn't look good if a co-founder or the major executive like her wants to sell out her shares. So fund number one, E&P fund number one, was created in a emergency liquidity vehicle to clean up her stake, which is why it came with no upside for Pang Xiao, in order to attract new investors. Okay, fund number two happened after BTS had broken globally, with especially with the album with Boy With Love was listed, and investor demand was sky high because of that. After BTS proved that they are not the so-called one-hit wonder, and their success and popularity are sustainable. So HYBE returned to a normal industry standard contract. And comparing the two without context is kind of misleading. Next, they hid it from the IPO filing. And HYBE did disclose the total float and submitted the contracts to their underwriter. Now, to prove deception here, you would have to show those missing details directly affected the market. And that's a pretty high bar, legally speaking, and one that's not currently met. And then they talk about relation rumors. Wasn't he secretly colluding with Kim Jong-dong to build a fake fund? Again, Kim Jong-dong was HYBE's early VC, venture capitalist, and strategy advisor. So yes, but he had no official HYBE position when those funds were created, and he didn't operate them. Both funds had independent managers and external capital. So, saying they knew each other doesn't automatically equal conspiracy. How about Pang Si-Hyuk secretly filed for a special audit just to fool investors? Because 지정감사, a special audit, is major part of IPO, and when you do that, it shows that you have a clear intention for going public. But actually, it turns out that the audit was requested by another group of shareholders, original investors, not Pang Si-Hyuk. Okay, so the idea that he was secretly plotting that move behind everyone's back doesn't really hold up here. So, how about this? Pang Si-Hyuk violated Article 178 of the Capital Markets Act, and that's clearly illegal, period. So Article 178 is designed to punish market-wide manipulation targeting the public. And this case revolves around private contracts between a handful of shareholders. And even the Supreme Court has said Article 178 is about protecting the fairness of the market, not the gains or losses of individual players. But retail investors got racked right after the IPO, they say. Again, first day one, yes, that happened. But HYBE was hardly the only IPO that slipped after, failing to double on debut. Its float was low, and the drop wasn't considered extraordinary compared to other listings at the time. He even burned the national pensions money. Actually, that's a hard no because the National Pension Service made money, tons of money. They invested in both HYBE's major pre-IPO funds and earned billions in gains. So far from a victim, they were actually one of the biggest beneficiaries. And then people talk about like BTS just got lucky and they inflated the IPO on hype. And saying IPO was hype more than just substance. But, I think luck doesn't give you like back-to-back Billboard number ones and sell-out stadiums tours on multiple continents. And that's sustained performance, and markets rewarded HYBE accordingly. But interestingly, so some people say that HYBE's IPO was destiny. It was bound to happen. But at the time, there were a lot of people, especially investors and experts, who doubted BTS' sustainable success, and they called Big Hit or HYBE, very BTS-focused company. I mean, it is still a BTS-focused company, but saying that if something happens to BTS, the whole company would fall apart, which is the reason that it's hard for them to go public. And that doubt was a huge risk factor at the time. So saying that BTS was bound to succeed globally and saying that Big Hit was bound to go public does not really make sense if you think about the conversations that happened around the time, and it's part of what I call a bit hindsight bias. Okay, what about this? Bang Si-Hyuk used the earn-out cash to buy a huge mansion in LA, so he flexed. Now, the bulk of that earn-out went into taxes, more than half of it. So, to be exact, 2,100억. So, 210 billion Korean won were paid in taxes, straight to the tax man. And another large portion of the earnout went back into HYBE itself as paid in capital. Okay, so instead of selling out his shares, Bang Si-Hyuk actually put more capital into HYBE as part of investment. And the LA property that they're talking about was bought as a working hub for artists, which in the US entertainment industry is a standard strategic investment, not a personal luxury splurge or something. So, at the end of the day, what will the judges actually consider? I think is in three parts. One, did Bang Si-Hyuk intentionally try to delay IPO expectations to mislead investors? Second, was the earn-out contract something investors should have been told about during the IPO? In other words, should it have been disclosed as material? And third, if, and above all, did anyone actually suffer real financial harm because of it? Existing shareholders, to be specific, did they suffer real quantifiable financial harm because of it? Okay, and if those three pillars aren't proven, it becomes very hard to get a criminal conviction. But the final answer, final judgment for that, we might have to wait for another 2 years or 3 years or something. So that brings us full circle. As you can see, this isn't a simple, good versus bad story. It's very messy legal and financial disputes involving market procedures most people never think about, which is exactly why headline level outrage leads to so much misunderstanding. And again, I'm not here to defend anyone blindly or to condemn anyone blindly, including even these people who write these kinds of comments. But I just believe that we should understand the context before deciding what to think. And the reality is this case will drag on for years. And whatever the outcome, the facts that come out along the way will matter. In the meantime, there are artists working very hard, and the staff and employees working silently behind the scenes. So I hope that we can at least keep their names out of unnecessary crossfire. Okay? And as more information comes out, I'll do my best to break it down so that it's easy to follow. All right? Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comment section. But as always, when you do so, let's stay positive, respectful, and classy. Thank you guys. Peace and love. Bye-bye.